I'm very honored to be with you in this Higher Ambition conference and to have the opportunity to open it with some thoughts and experiences from my own work and that of my colleagues on what I call higher ambition, high commitment, high performance companies. By higher ambition and by higher ambition leadership and higher ambition companies, we mean companies that are dedicated to at least two outcomes. Creating economic value and creating social value. And by social value, we really mean creating social capital within the firm, trust and commitment from employees, and trust and commitment from other stakeholders, customers, suppliers, partners, and yes, even investors. There's ample evidence that organizations are failing to really, on a number of these counts, trust in CEOs and trust in companies and corporations have declined significantly. Employee satisfaction has declined over the last 20 years. There are ample evidence of scandals and greed that have undermined many corporations, including here in the United States, Enron and WorldCom. There's evidence that's been available for at least 20 years or 25 or 30 years that companies export things that are not so good for the health and welfare of their employees. Health and welfare is affected by the nature of work. In fact, in Europe, this has been a matter of significant studies by my colleagues in the industrial and organizational community. So there's a lot of evidence and of course there's evidence that firms don't sustain over a long period of time. Increasingly, firms disappear, and CEO tenure has shortened significantly in the U.S., and I suspect this is also happening in Europe. So there's a lot of reason to think that we have to believe that we need to think differently about the nature of corporations, what the purpose of the company is, how it should measure itself, how it should manage, and how managers should lead. And we call this higher ambition leadership. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how I've come to understand what higher ambition is all about. It is rooted in deep experiences I've had, first at Corning Incorporated early in my career when I made an unconventional choice for someone who had a PhD, not to go to the academy, but to go to work for a real company with real problems. And through action research, that is, working with managers to make changes and then evaluating and researching the outcomes, a number of insights began there that I'm going to share with you. And then later at the Harvard Business School, a number of research studies and also consulting and action research work I did there also informed a number of things about what higher ambition companies are about, ending, of course, with the work that my colleagues and I have made with the book Higher Ambition. So I'm going to be talking from the knowledge that's incorporated in two books, Higher Ambition, How Great Leaders Create Economic and Social Value, and my book several years ago, High Commitment, High Performance, How to Build a Resilient Company with Sustained Advantage. Overall, these research studies have identified three critical outcomes that all companies that aspire to create sustained commitment from all their stakeholders and sustained performance over a period of time have to be concerned with. The first of these I call performance alignment, which is the extent to which the company, its structure, its processes, its people capabilities and organizational capabilities enable the accomplishment of outstanding performance outcomes. The extent to which the organization and its people are aligned, if you will, with the performance goals and strategy of the company. I'll talk a little bit about where some of these insights came from. The second is psychological alignment, the extent to which the people in the organization and other stakeholders are emotionally attached to the company. They really believe in it. They really trust the company and the mission, its purpose, its products, and come to a deep commitment that enables the relationship between the firm and its stakeholders to weather a number of potential problems that always arise in any long-term relationship and still come out at the other end with commitment. And finally, the capacity for the organization to reevaluate its alignment, both its performance alignment and its psychological alignment, to assess the extent to which the system is continuing to be aligned and the extent to which it needs to be realigned to sustain both economic value and social value. Where did I come up with these insights? Perhaps the first and most profound experience I had was when shortly after I joined what was then Corning Glassworks, now Corning Incorporated. I was a brand new PhD. I had only been on the job about 6 or 9 months when the phone rang. And I had a call from a small manufacturing plant making a very different kind of product for Corning, an instrument as opposed to simply a glass product. It had glass in it, but it had a lot of electronics in it as well. From this plant, and the VP of HR and the HR manager in this plant basically said to me, our team has decided that we need to run a very different kind of plant because all of us have had experience in Corning's traditional plants, and we need to have much more dedication, much more commitment, much more concern about quality. This is a medical instrument than we think we could get from the workforce that we've seen in our other plants. And we've read McGregor's book, The Human Side of Enterprise, and we've decided that we want to become a Theory Y plant. Well, in McGregor's terms, Theory Y was a participative form of management whose assumptions were that people were willing and able to make contributions, and as opposed to what he called Theory X leadership and management, which was making the assumption that people wanted to get away with as much as they could and do as little as they could, and that they didn't have the capabilities to really contribute. And so over about a 3 to 4 year period of time of continuous work with management, we began to make significant changes. Some snippets of the experience there illustrate the kinds of changes that began to occur and the kinds of insights that managers began to have. I remember very clearly a first-line supervisor, or an engineer rather, who was working with part of the floor in a manufacturing plant, coming up to me and saying, "Mike, I just went out there to talk about rearranging the production floor to make it more efficient, more effective, and I got no questions from any of the employees." And I said to, well, his name was Lou Maccarelli. I said to Lou, "Lou, did you go out there with your plan, or did you go out to first ask them about, what they thought the problems were in the floor and get their suggestions and ideas?" He said, "No, I came out there with a plan, and I told them what I think what we'll be doing." I said, "Go back and try another meeting. Try it with more involvement." And of course, what happened was people began to talk, people to get involved. Managers and supervisors like Lou Maccarelli began to get new insights about the way in which they might lead that would get much more engagement. And over time, this began to spread around this small plant to the point where actually we began to realize that we needed to change the nature of work itself and to get people involved in making a whole instrument and taking more responsibility for quality, to get them to talk to other departments, to find out what they were doing. And of course, in the process, we learned something early on about process improvement, because they began to see where the handoffs between departments weren't working. We try to put the results of the plant up on the bulletin board, profits, revenue, in order to inform people about what was going on. Of course, in those days, we heard from the corporation that you couldn't do that because that was proprietary information. Well, what shouldn't be proprietary if you want people engaged? And ultimately, we began to win that fight and give them much more information. And we invited doctors to come in and tell them about how the instrument was used and how important their work in putting it together was, and so on. the people began to change. The plant began to change. The culture changed. This was a new plant. It began to be the best startup. It was the best startup of a plant in Corning's history. Perhaps the biggest test of how things changed was when management decided to lower the standards, the quality standards for the product, because they realized that they had been set so high and didn't need to be set quite as high in order to meet all the obligations of the plant had, moral and regulatory obligations, as well as customer expectations. And when they did that, there was a mini rebellion in the plant by the employees. They wanted to know why quality was being downgraded. They had become so committed to really creating a quality instrument. The insights here were that you can get tremendous psychological alignment, real attachment, emotional attachment to the purpose and values and performance of an organization by the way you engage employees. That began a long history of understanding the importance of that kind of emotional attachment and development of engagement in organizations, which today is pretty common knowledge, although I don't think it's well done in a lot of organizations. Shortly after this project, in fact, indeed, because of the success of this project, a new vice president and general manager of one of Corning's divisions called me and said, "Mike, I'd like to talk to you. I've got some problems in my organization. We are really experiencing a lot of conflict between groups. Today we would call these silos. That's a term that's emerged. And we're having a lot of problems with conflict, particularly between marketing and manufacturing. We're having a lot of problems in getting products out, new products out, because of this conflict. At least we've experienced a decline in new product introductions and so on. Morale is low, and my people are telling me, oh, if the business only got better, things would get better. But I have a hunch that things are fundamentally wrong here. Could you find out if there are problems and what they are, how serious they are, and what I should do about it?" And that began a long several-year engagement with this general manager and his senior team and the organization in trying to understand and improve and change their performance. Their performance had been very poor when he took over, taken over from a very autocratic founder of this business, and performance had improved through cost cutting, but yet the real performance and growth wasn't there. And so out of that emerged some data collection. The senior team dedicated itself to really understanding the problem and developing jointly with us, my team of consultants, internal consultants, a plan for reorganizing the division around teams, product development teams that cut across the functions, having people learn how to operate in those teams. There was a lot of support given to these teams to really get them going. And of course, and then we discovered, one of the first things we discovered was that the senior team was not working very well in terms of really guiding this product development process, prioritizing the products. They had new product development meetings that were casts of thousands, and really conflict wasn't surfaced there between the functions, and people went back and did what they were always doing. So we recast the whole strategic management process with the senior team taking responsibility for oversight of these product development project teams, as opposed to getting into the details of these product development teams, and then creating and then really focusing on prioritization and so forth. Without going into further detail, this organization began to improve its performance, morale and commitment improved. These product development teams taught people how to work collaboratively over time, and the organization fundamentally trajectory of performance and commitment changed dramatically. If you will, what this demonstrated was the ability to really, the importance of performance alignment. That is, if the organizational structure, processes, The leadership team is not working properly in its role in guiding the organization and prioritizing things and in developing a mechanism for engagement at lower levels around different problems, the organization would not perform well. And in fact, as soon as we realigned the organization, reorganized, re-engaged the culture and getting people to operate differently in these teams, things began to improve dramatically. Product development improved significantly over that period of time. And if you will, and ultimately the performance sustained itself across several different new general managers. In fact, the general manager of this division ultimately became the president of the company, large, in part at least, on the basis of the success of this particular transformation. So organizations need to be thinking constantly about how they are performing and how they are aligned with performance, and they need to change that alignment in a way that sustains commitment and creates commitment. And there was a high engagement process involved here. So that was some early insights into both psychological alignment, the importance of emotional attachment, and the importance of aligning and realigning and being the organization. When I moved to the Harvard Business School, about 11 years, after 11 years at building a group that was working internally within companies, and I might ask you, how many of you have some internal capacity to help managers learn and think about realignment in their organization? I had a number of research projects that further informed my book, High Commitment, High Performance, and Higher Ambition, and develop and create a base of knowledge, along with other colleagues who created similar knowledge. For example, around the Medfield plant, which I just described, there were a whole bunch of high commitment, high performance experiments that were going on in various different industries that illustrated the same kind of capacity for creating commitment on employees that were thought not to be willing to make contributions. At HBS, one of the first assignments I had was to create a new course in human resource management. We had to find a company, not a plant, but a company that operated in a way that I had learned employees can be engaged. And I came across this company, and it was Hewlett-Packard in the 80s when I was doing this work. And I went out to Hewlett-Packard and did significant research and wrote a case on Hewlett-Packard. And I was just stunned to find that here was a whole corporation that was a global corporation at that time that was highly successful in its performance, that had figured out how to really create significant both performance alignment and psychological alignment over a period of several decades by the time I got there. And it was just an amazing thing to see the extent to which engagement had been occurred, and the practices that these companies had were significantly different from those that most companies employed. For example, managing by walking around. Managers were asked and required as part of the management task that 50% of their time was to be talking to people to find out what was going on. Senior management took steps to go to really talk to people at lower levels without their bosses present, so they could learn about ideas, that technology, products, innovation, and other matters of concern that normally would not rise up in the hierarchy. They had a tremendously powerful open door policy that allowed individuals to go and talk to the senior management about any concerns, or their own boss in any concern, and there was an organized process for doing this. They had very interesting financial policies that supported this high commitment, high performance, higher ambition that David Packard and Bill Hewlett had for the company. When I discovered, for example, that the company had no long-term debt. It was all short-term debt. So I went to Bob Wayman, who was then the chief financial officer, and I said, Bob, I'm not from finance, but I understand that you don't have any debt. Can you tell me why? Why don't you leverage yourself? Every company knows leverage is important. He said it's very simple. We do not want to grow too fast, and we don't want to expose ourselves to downside risk from external forces. And so basically we try to self-finance ourselves. If we grow too fast through financing ourselves by leverage, we're going to have to hire a lot of people that don't fit our culture, and we will not be able to sustain our culture. So without going into further detail about finance, one of the things I discovered was that to create a system, you had to look at the internal HR practices, at the financial practices. You had to have a strategy that's connected to that. For example, HP decided not to take defense contracts because those defense contracts had significant ups and downs. They created a system, a corporate-wide system, and they applied that system in every country in the world. I later found this out when I taught this case in another company, and somebody from Mexico raised their hands and said, "Oh, I know those people upstairs. They're from Hewlett-Packard. Now I understand why they do crazy things, like call each other by first names and not have any offices." In fact, at HP, no one had an office. Even the CEO was in a bullpen, as I discovered when I first visited there, and someone in a sea of 3,000 bullpens showed me where John Young, who was then the CEO of the company, sat, just like every other engineer and manager in that situation. So HP, to me, was an inspiring story of the potential for companies to really to develop a higher ambition, high commitment, high performance organization. But as we know today, Hewlett-Packard didn't sustain itself. Today, the company is different than it was. So the problem of sustainability over time and the ability to adapt over time began to be an important subject of concern. And my insights with Russ Eisenstadt about that really started in 1990 when we had a call from Ray Gilmartin, then the CEO of Becton Dickinson. He and his vice president, Ralph Bigadike, of HR and strategy and HR, interesting combination, were concerned that the company had a strategy, and in fact, it was a good strategy. They had a lot of reasons to believe it was a good strategy. All the senior managers at Becton Dickinson had been consultants, senior consultants with some of the best consulting firms in the world. And they had developed a clear idea of what the company needed to do to succeed. They had great products. They couldn't, however, move them overseas and get them integrated into their various subsidiaries, partly because of the inability to break the silos between the U.S. and other regions in the world. And they were struggling. They'd created some teams that were not working very well, that were supposed to incorporate ideas and move things forward. And they asked us to not only help them with this problem, but to essentially help them create a company capable of sustained execution of its strategy and so on. And so, taking all the learnings that I had, we began to think about this problem. And the problem was how the company could align itself, both psychologically and in a performance sense, with where it was trying to go. And so we had to find a way to do that. As a consultant internally at Corning and other companies, I had done that through my own data gathering. But we decided to create a very high engagement process whereby a senior team could look at the total system, at all the policies and practices, and their alignment with the strategy and values, and to use that engagement process to really create a collective understanding by the senior team of how the organization was aligned or not aligned with values and strategy. And we've called this the strategic fitness process. But the key idea here was, could we create an honest conversation with the senior team, with the organization, about what the real barriers were to performance and commitment? And we did that by simply asking the senior team to write down in 2 pages what they were trying to do and why they were trying to do it, what their strategy and their values were, something that we discovered those senior teams had not done very well, by the way. And even though in a strategy company they worked a lot about strategy, these things were still not in total agreement about the direction they wanted to go. And then to appoint a task force of 8 or 9 or 10 of their best people to go out and interview 100 others, we discovered that was enough, even at the large corporate level or certainly in a business unit, to talk to 100 people about across all the silos, across the value chain, across all parts of the company geographically, representative sample, about what it was that was blocking, as people saw it, the ability of the company to achieve its strategic goals. And that conversation was often very rich between the interviewee and the task force and the interview, and very open, and we discovered a number of core barriers we've come to call the silent killers, the silent barriers that include the senior team, the leader, the collaborative culture of the organization, the leadership or lack thereof of development of down-the-line leaders, and also the inability to really talk about these issues in an open way. We call these, as I said, the silent killers. And then we had to find a way to get the task force to talk openly with the senior team. We created some mechanisms. One of them was it is a fishbowl of where they talk to each other with the senior team listening. But without going into detail, we've learned that honest, collective, and public conversations, empowering truth to speak to power, is an extremely powerful way to get senior management to attend to both the emotional concerns and of the employees and the realities of where the organization is not aligned, to discover how they might recreate the system in a different way and what their role in this was. So this added a component of how you actually create the capacity for change. We think of it as a total quality process for leadership and management, that it is a continuous improvement process. And in some companies, that was so. At Becton Dickinson, it was used quite a bit in the first 5 years. Ed Ludwig, who became the CEO, had used it as a business unit manager, used it several times as a corporate leader. So these are some of the core ideas that led to my book, High Commitment, High Performance. And then we said we wanted to go out and speak to CEOs who were high commitment, high performance leaders, like an Ed Ludwig. But we chose 36 based on our knowledge of the performance of the company and their commitment. And we went out and interviewed them. And two of my colleagues are with you, Tobias Fredberg and Fleming Norgren, both professors at Chalmers, were part of this study, along with my colleague Russ Eisenstadt and Nathaniel Foote here in the U.S. And out of that came the book, Higher Ambition. We wanted to find out how CEOs saw and led and thought about what they were trying to do when they were leading a firm that was clearly concerned about economic and social value, both not employees but also with other stakeholders. And that book, Higher Ambition, really identifies what we call disciplines, 6 disciplines that managers really employ to try to develop this kind of a higher ambition company that creates economic and social value, that creates psychological alignment, performance alignment, and is flexible and adaptive. And let me just talk briefly about what those are, and then I think there'll be a lot more discussion later in the conference about the details of this. The important point about these disciplines is not just what the practices are, because there are many practices that underlie each discipline. I will not have a chance to really go into this in detail at this point. But it's important to understand that these disciplines are underpinned by a clear purpose and set of values. So, for example, one of the first disciplines is forging strategic identity. That's a discipline, and it's different from creating strategy. Strategy is a head process. Forging strategic identity involves incorporating into strategy purpose and values, defining customers, defining markets, defining contribution, as David Packard called it, what the purpose of the firm was in terms of what it would contribute, defining strategy in those terms, not just in market availability and customer needs for the product. And so forging identity requires purpose. It requires clarity in values and aligning those and integrating them together. And to support that identity, there are 5 other disciplines that basically these leaders employ. One of them we call building a shared commitment to excel. This is a lot about performance alignment, performance improvement, but building commitment through many of the mechanisms I sort of at least mentioned briefly, high involvement in creating goals, very similar to what HP had, tremendous participation in goal setting, not task setting, and then letting people really do what they needed to do by delegating. Creating peer accountability for performance, for example. A second is what we call creating a community of purpose, very much what I found at HP, what I saw early on in my Corning experience, and we saw in these companies that these CEOs were concerned about community. How do you get people connected to each other and to the purpose and values of the firm and its performance goals in a way that that overcomes a lot of the significant diversity that all of them wanted and began to build into their company, particularly as they went global. Recognizing diversity is a strength, but then challenges then the ability to get people connected. And in many ways, this was done in a lot of different ways in different companies. In one company, we know United Stationers, getting employees in every regional location. This is a distributor. They have a lot of warehouses. Getting them connected to creating committees there to make them make decisions about what contributions they want to make to the community, and from that creating a good for the community, but also building a lot of commitment and a lot of and relationships that also benefited the business, and then ultimately drawing customers into this kind of a giving atmosphere. And it was a very powerful mechanism. But so building a community is critical. Unlocking collective leadership, that is getting more leaders to lead in a higher ambition way across the company. As Doug Conant, the former CEO of Campbell Soup, who's also part of the study, said, you have to kind of let other people, you can govern, but by letting other people really manage the business as much as you can. And so part of it is delegating and holding people responsible for outcomes, but also developing leaders in a way that they have a general management capability, shared values, and shared purpose. Learning and governance is a discipline that actually didn't get into the book, but is really but we decided really did show up in the interviews, and so we put it up as as one of the disciplines, which really comes out of the work that we did at Becton Dickinson on having the capacity for honest conversations, looking at the system, recognizing the system is constantly evolving. It's a management system, an organizational system, a culture that has to be looked at. It has to be tended to, has to be managed. So there has to be some disciplined process, and that's why we call these disciplines, for discovering what the alignment was between values and strategy and organization and culture, and where that had to be adapted, and what the leadership and senior team role in all this is also very critical. And the final one we called SISU leadership. SISU is a term that Fleming and Tobias brought to us and said, in Finland, because they talk about SISU as a capacity to overcome odds and difficulty and physical challenges, particularly in cross-country, the cross-country skiing sport, as a critical dimension. And so we adopted the term SISU leadership to indicate that essentially leadership of higher ambition companies requires enormous energy and commitment beyond what it takes in normal companies to really sustain these kinds of cultures and this kind of a focus on both economic value and social value, on purpose and values and culture. This takes a lot of work beyond simply looking at the financials and managing in a normal and usually a good way, but not a sufficient way if you're trying to create a higher ambition company. So SISU leadership is being willing to sustain this effort over a long period of time and getting others to sustain this effort to stay connected to purpose. At Hewlett-Packard, they at least achieved it for 6 decades, which is not very, which is still a very good record. We compare it to many other companies. So these are some of the ideas that we're now working on. They're all connected to a stream of our research, the research of my colleagues. There's a lot of evidence that these things are actually supporting a sustained commitment and performance on companies. It's been my pleasure to introduce the conference with some of these ideas. I know you're going to work on these in a lot more detail and hear more about the 6 disciplines, about higher ambition leadership and higher ambition companies. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you, and have a great conference. Thank you.